All right, welcome to episode 23 of the Middle Ground podcast. Imam Marc here, along with brother Dawud Aleman. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. I just wanted to hear the intro there.
Oh man, so our hearts are a little heavy this week. Want to dedicate this one to our dear brother Jamal Ramsey, who passed away just a couple days ago, and we're still in the midst of dealing with his janazah and whatnot. So first, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on our brother and bless him, and inshallah make him from amongst those who will enter into paradise without any reckoning, inshallah. You and I both knew Jamal quite well and for quite a while.
Yeah.
It's matter of fact, we just got through praying the Asr prayer, and he was one of the brothers here at Middle Ground. For people that don't know, we're not typically open for all of the prayers, but there's a few brothers in the community that have a key and come and they pray whenever they want. And so we've always been kind of toying with that idea of doing the 5 prayers,
Right.
and he was definitely one of the brothers that you could rely upon to always be here. Like he was here for every single prayer, and he was just like one of these light fixtures, man. He was a real part of the community,
Right.
So it was quiet. It was different today without him.
It's definitely a loss of word. I have a loss of words for that. Like you said, knowing him for so long and engaging with him and breaking bread with him, and being one of the first brothers. Actually, I also met when I first got here, because I'm not a native to Southern California, and and we had our shared experiences, and when it's one thing you say, okay, pray for a brother, so and so passed away, but then it's nobody was the brother we just prayed with on Friday, or we just spoke with on such and such day. Man, he's gone.
Yeah,
really,
man.
So there's that. And I feel this way for all of our brothers and sisters who pass or might be mentioned on the minbar, at the podium on a Friday prayer. I feel that you feel this, the ruh, the soul has departed, and that's it. There's no more get back. And, you have that sense of your community when somebody leaves, whether they're in Pakistan or some other country. But, it's just another thing when it's right there that day. You just saw someone.
Yeah.
Man. So it's a heavy heart. Yeah.
And in particular, with Jamal, he was somebody that was, very beloved to the community. Whether you were talking about in the convert community, non-convert community. Matter of fact, when we had announced, his passing, I'm part of the WhatsApp group over at the Claremont Masjid, and like right away.
Oh.
They had posted it, and people were like, "Oh man, no, not Jamal! Like he was such a wonderful brother. He was great. He was this. He was that." So he's somebody that definitely enjoyed a lot of. He got a lot of love and respect from,
Right.
From everybody. And so again, somebody that will be very sorely missed. But we wanted to talk a little bit about, that as well. We talked a little bit about, preparing for death when I had my heart attack, a couple months ago. And so we wanted to talk about being prepared, but from a slightly different perspective.
Right. So in this strange climate of change globally, whether that's economically, socially, politically, and we're just seeing this whole change even within America, there's this other dynamics that we're not sometimes really focused on as individuals and a community, as especially for Muslims and believers. I mean, believers in general, people in general, it's just not a conversation that's had about death and are we prepared for our family, the aftermath, if you will, of finance, preparation of maybe the burial, all these logistics that, it's glossed over. That's way over there,
I mean, I had to confront that when I was having my heart attack. My wife was on a plane coming back from Dubai, and I wasn't able to communicate, like, hey, I'm going to the emergency room. And so I just texted alhamdulillah, I had to use my wasiyah, and I'll put some links up in the show notes and up on our Substack about some resources about, if you haven't made yourself a will and that kind of thing. But even beyond having a will, it's one thing to say, okay, well, if I die, my wife gets this and my daughter gets that and so on and so on. It's another thing of like, how do you get access to my bank? How do you get access to, all kinds of personal information that I have tucked away, not on purpose, like I'm hiding it, but just, we live our lives, think like, well, what happens if I'm not able to speak or communicate?
Right.
How does my wife get that? How would my parents get that? So, here I am having a heart attack and I'm texting my wife, like, here's the password to my password manager. Here's Imam Suhaib's phone number. Here's Dawud's phone number. Here's Khalil's phone number. Here's my brother's phone number. Here's my parent, just like this flurry of, just, well, if I don't make it, at least you can figure out how to, crack the code or whatever.
Right.
So, yeah, like, preparedness. There's the spiritual preparedness, worshiping Allah, repenting, trying to, get your book that will be read to you, get that affair in order as much as possible. But then, like, your dunya affairs as well.
And like you mentioned, too, we might, we heard the term preppers. We're prepping for third world wars. We're prepping for disasters. We're prepping for man-made disasters, whatever it might be. We got 10 months worth of stored food, things like that. But what if somebody passes away, and not only the person, within your dynamics, mom, dad, your wife, yourself have prepared, but then has one of the spouses, family members, are they truly prepared when that soul departs as well?
Yeah.
So there's a lot to unpack here tonight. Inshallah, God willing. So, yeah.
And then I think the part that I wanted to touch upon, and even though I didn't want to make the whole podcast episode like a lesson in Islamic law as it relates to will and testament and personal estates and whatnot, I do feel like it's worthwhile to touch upon in that, like with our brother Jamal, and like many of us that are converts, they have a blended family situation, meaning there are parts of the family that are Muslim and there are parts of the family that are not Muslim. And so, just kind of to put it out there, like in Islam, we tend to think in English inheritance in a very abstract, overly simplified way.
Well, I think that's a good point. What is the difference between you inherit and a will? Isn't the will
right?
Inheriting
and so
we
tend to think those as either interchangeable,
right,
one and the same. And so in Islam, no. In Islam, first off, there's inheritance, what we call mirath, right, or irth, right. So that is a process that occurs upon a Muslim's death, by which people who Allah Ta'ala has defined, or who the Prophet ﷺ has defined, automatically have istihqaqat, or they automatically have entitlements to that person's estate, so to speak, whether they want it or not.
Okay.
Right? And so I have a little list that I'll read off of here in a minute, but so there's that. Then there is what we call like a bequest or a bequeathment or a will. which is you're writing in things that I want A, B, and C to go to so-and-so, right? Like I want my Apple Watch to go to Uncle Roger or to whomever, right? So that's a separate thing. So there's two different trajectories when a person dies of how people can get access to their stuff, if you want to say, right? And this is, again, this is not meant to be like Islamic,
too deep in the,
Islamic finance as it relates to, and there's great resources. I mean, you have people like Sheikh Joe Bradford and others that have developed, there's a great website sort of app called My Wasiya, which if you haven't done, I would definitely recommend to do. Again, I'll drop a link in for that. And it's pretty much it's like a worksheet format. You make a login and then you just plug in your info. I am so-and-so and I have these kinds of assets and I have, a wife who's either a Muslim or not Muslim, and I have children who are either Muslim or not Muslim. And at the end of it, right, I'm being very succinct, it will spit out a PDF for you that basically has your will as a Muslim. And it can have instructions in there like, hey, if I die, don't throw me in the air fryer, right? Like I want my body to be washed and I want it to be wrapped and I want to be buried and I don't want, some big mausoleum. Like it can have all those things in there so that you can take and have that notarized. So you'll get the PDF from like My Wasiya, but you can take that to a notary and have it stamped. And then that can become a legally binding document of which you can say no, and I had a good friend of mine, Imran, brother Ron, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him. This is going back 30 years, who was killed in a hit and run accident on his way home from work one night. And Ron had been Muslim for, like many of us, he'd only been Muslim for a few years, but he's very sincere about his Islam. But his family never really accepted it. Or, it's just a phase. Or at the end of the story, when Ron died, we were like, oh, well, we got to give him a janazah. And the family was like, no, we're going to, his name is Ron, and we're going to bury him like a Christian, even though the family knew that he was a Muslim. But, right. And we had no legal means to step in on his behalf.
Yep.
To ensure that. And so it's something that I really recommend that people do. Again, again, we always think of prepping as like having 6 months of canned tuna and water, or, praying all of your prayers and doing all, this is another aspect of prepping.
Right. The one that's forgotten the most. And so I think one of the key notes is that, as the Imam mentioned, he'll leave a link there. Don't gloss over it. Just even you haven't mapped it all out, at least put something down on paper, because there's been many of us and many brothers who said, yeah, I'm going to do it tomorrow, and tomorrow never came. And now there's this strife or this vying for power, the money, the control. Well, I'm the oldest. Well, I'm the closest. Well, I'm this, I'm that. I should, you shouldn't. And it just, because there was no clear roadmap of what to do. Also, another key factor, especially for converts, and maybe, Muslims in general living in a non-Muslim country, if you don't have the legal documents clarified as to how I want to be buried.
Yeah.
Many people don't know, if none of that stuff is well documented, well, the state takes over some of these things.
Right.
They step in and say, oh, well,
if you think that, oh, well, we're all Muslims, even if there isn't any discord, even if there isn't any disagreement, if you pass away and you think it's just a matter of, well, my wife gets the house and the kids get this. No, it'll have to go through probate court and
nothing was documented.
Yeah, exactly. So, and to be honest, like we're even dealing a little bit of that right now with Brother Jamal, in that the other part that I was going to get to is like there is a difference as it relates to mirath or inheritance, right? Which is that kind of like auto process, right? Allah has designated in the Quran that there are certain people that have, again, istihqaq. They have an entitlement whether they want it or not, to a Muslim, like a Muslim wife and siblings and children, parents and grand. They have an entitlement to some share, right? Because it's based upon shares of that person's estate, whether they want it or not. The flip of that is a non-Muslim has zero entitlement to that, and also a Muslim has zero entitlement to a non-Muslim. So if I happen to be a Muslim that's married to, say, a Christian woman, and she's technically a non-Muslim, right? She cannot inherit from me as an auto process, right? She has no entitlements. Now I can make a wasiyah, which is what Allah describes in the Quran, right? And that's what we'll talk about.
Is what?
That's the bequeathment.
The will,
right? Well, yeah. Again, let's dismiss the word will, because I think will, where there's a will, there's a way, right? There, sometimes where there's a will, that's not always the way, right? Okay. I think we need to try to get as close as we can to using the Quranic terminology, because again, in our background as Westerners, as Americans, again, these can sometimes be conflated in our head as one of the same thing, especially if you're not like a legal expert. You're not, you're not a person that has a law degree, and you're not used to doing, will and testament or will or inheritance, all the same thing. No, they're not. Right. So there is a prohibition. A Muslim cannot inherit from la yarithu al-Muslim al-kafir wa la yarithu al-kafir al-Muslim, right? The Muslim cannot inherit from a non-Muslim, and a non-Muslim cannot inherit from a Muslim. Mm-hmm. Now, that person can be given a gift, a wasiyah, but they cannot, right? So in our case, we had a situation where the wife wanted something and had called me as the imam. I want my husband's X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, well, I can't just give it to you. Hey, I'm not, I have no claim to those things because I'm not even family, right? So I have no entitlements. Even though I'm a Muslim, I don't have any entitlement to it. So I can't just give it to you. But most importantly, you don't have any entitlement to it. And if it was not specifically designated in the wasiyah, in the bequeathment, then you have zero entitlement to it. Now, again, this is all Sharia and how it might be adjudicated in American family law and the legal system. This is why, again, having the wasiyah to put into legal words how you want all of that to be carried out according to Islam, right, is extremely necessary, because if you leave it to post-mortem, there's a very high likely that it's not going to turn out how you wanted it to happen.
Right. Definitely. Well, and I was just having this discussion with my mother over the weekend, and she was telling me about one of her friends. The father of her friend, which is a close friend to my dad, so they kind of knew the whole family very well. They buried the father. My mother and dad went down to do the funeral procession and things like that. They're Christian. And the daughter, she was explaining to my mom, they're close friends, my dad told me I can just live in the house. And he had already written out on the will all of, the money and what should be given to who. And she says, so my kids, because they're in the will, said, hey, Mom, we want the house. Sell the house. I said, well, your grandfather said I can live in it. Yeah, well, that's okay. We just need the money now. Sell the house.
Right.
and get your stuff out and go somewhere. Like, what? Like, that's her kids, the grandkids, and they're like, hey, Mom, pack it up, sell the house, and give us the money. So, but because Grandpa did not state it in the will that my daughter can live in this house, so people turn real quick, your own kids.
Yes, and I've seen that happen many times with families, especially as a Muslim, or as an imam. This is not my first rodeo with this. I apologize for the banana.
Okay.
The brothers they turned this joint into like a Somali restaurant, man. There's like a whole bunch of bananas in here. But I've dealt with this many, many times where there was all of this verbal back and forth, but none of it reflected in the legal binding document.
Right.
And then, and I think this is where maybe both of us, we want to really highlight is that it's not just that you want to make sure everybody gets what they're supposed to get.
No, right.
Of course. I mean, that's part of it. The other thing is you want to save people, save your loved ones from tearing out each other's throats over these things. And so we were talking like before the podcast, and I think like sometimes as men, right, you have this idea like you want to be the protector of your family, right?
Right.
And that's great. You know, you go and take your Brazilian jiu-jitsu and you got your strap and you got your 6 months of tuna and bottled water and all that,
Good.
you know, and that's great. But what have you also done to protect your family from tearing out each other's throats over, you know, over the stuff that you, and I've seen like people ain't got nothing left behind. They got 2 dimes and they're ripping out each other's throats over getting a sliver of these couple of coins. So, you know, it's an emotional time, as you talked about. You know, there's the grieving process. So people are trying to process the loss of a loved one.
Yeah.
They're grieving, but then Shaitan steps in because that's his opportunity to whisper to people, "Hey, that's your stuff." You know.
Right. I was closer to dad anyway.
Exactly. You know, you never did anything for mom. You never did anything for dad. I was the one that did everything.
Right.
I'm deserving of X, Y, and Z.
Or you might just get people out of the woodwork.
And you will have that too.
Like I was sharing with you. I mean, you have married the spouse of someone. Let's say you have brothers, and then the spouse of one of the brothers is saying, "Hey, you're more entitled. You know, your dad should have left you, or your mom should have left you.
Dog.
You're I think a little more entitled. You did X, Y, and Z." So you got all these factors that show up, and if things ain't clear, as the man was saying, we're protecting our family, and we should be protecting them here and after as well,
right,
in many different ways.
Because I've seen some families implode,
Man.
where now you have people because 40 years ago, when the father or the grandfather or the grandmother died, and those things were not clearly stipulated, that it caused rift in families that become a generational rift, right? So you might have had like your great uncle, right, have some beef with your great grandmother, right, over that, and then that transferred down to your mom and your uncle, and now that's come down to you and your cousins.
Yeah.
And so like 3 generations later, of which those 2 generations, they're all dead and in the ground.
Right.
And here there's this family feud going on.
Yeah. Now
and people are, and we know about the tahrim of the silat al-rahim, right? We know that Islam vehemently prohibits severing ties of the womb.
Yeah.
And yet, one of the main pathways to people severing their family ties is over, precisely this issue of just a plan not being laid out.
Right.
Again, I think I'm sure that there are multiple scenarios of which this would apply to born Muslims, but I think especially for so-called converts, many of us, we embraced Islam and maybe had a life before where we were married before, or we had kids before, and maybe some of our, like in the case of like Brother Jamal, some of his kids are Muslim, some of his kids are not Muslim, right? His wife, not Muslim. So how does all that, and that could breed resentment. Oh, wait a minute, the daughter who is Muslim, she gets to have this, but I'm his son, or I'm his other daughter, but you're telling me just because I'm not a Muslim, I can't get that. Well, I know my dad wouldn't do that to me. That's not my dad. Yeah. So to save your children from having resentment towards each other for the rest of their lives, over your crappy baseball card collection or whatever that it is, right? Save them from themselves.
Yeah, it should
and
be
put these
clarified.
things in. And then especially if in the case of, let's say, you are married to your wife who's a Christian and you love your wife, but she's not Muslim. So she gets no entitlement, but you still love your wife. You don't want to leave her hanging. Well, the only way you can ensure that she gets something is through the wasiyah, is through the bequeathment. And as we'll see, maybe you can add something, and at the end I'll go to a few of the technical things just to give people kind of like an intro to it. Because again, this will not be sufficient for people to know all the ins and outs. You should definitely seek some professional financial Islamic legal counseling of putting these things together. But at least this could give people
roadmap.
Yeah, a roadmap of what to do.
So another thing too is having that discussion. Like I said, I was speaking with my mother, and my mother, she's had that discussion with my father, and they've already mapped out everything, so to speak. And my brother, who's closer to them, will handle all of that affair. And me and my sister are like, no, that's fine. I mean, he's right there. Why wouldn't he? I'm not over there. I can't jump in the scene. So he understands everything. My sister lives in a whole nother state. She's like, I'm fine with it. Brother knows he's right there. So, but because they've had that discussion and made it clear, I seen this with my grandfather. He told all of my mom and the rest of her siblings, hey, I'm giving such and such to your younger brother. You guys okay with that?
Yes.
So it's clear before you pass away, not just on paper. So in many cases too, like we'll go back with Brother Jamal, his daughter knew how he wanted to be buried, and she was very clear with us. Hey, like she doesn't know the ins and outs, but it should be only 3 days, right? We got to do this in 3 days.
Right.
I mean, she had some. She was cognizant of the Islamic adab and all of the different traditions, and
Yes.
to a certain degree. So, are we having that conversation with our family, with our kids? What if both parents passed away? I mean.
Yes.
So now what do the kids do? They don't know what we had that discussion already.
Yes.
So they know, go to uncle, go to so-and-so. Naturally, we would probably all do that, but the preparation in the mind, and I saw it firsthand that day, Jamal's daughter knew what was going on. Even though she was crying, she was sad, she could report to me and explain to me very coherently what's supposed to take place, and just let me know, and I can respond back to her like, hey, this is what we're going to do. These are the numbers you need to contact, and hold these ones, and then we'll get past it. So I mean, so that's another thing we have to remember. At the moment of tragedy in our religion, what does the Prophet ﷺ say? Patience.
Yes.
At the moment of, we have patience. So hold on. That's why I was telling her, just okay, hold on. Like once you get your head together, let's get past this part of the police and all that, and get that out of the way. And once you get your head a little bit together, then we're going to move on to the next step. And so clearly, Brother Jamal had already been having these conversations with his kids.
Yes.
So, and even his son, he was telling me, no, I know he's good. He would pray all the time. We'd be driving, and we got to stop. What? Dad's got to pray.
Yes.
You can pull over and pray right here. Dad, I'm going to pray right now. So as Jamal, that's your dad.
And that's an important part, as I think we also, like yesterday when we were kind of brainstorming, is that we tend to think of da'wah. Okay, if I'm going to call a person to Islam, or inviting our loved ones, our family and friends to Islam, it's all about, tawheed. It's all about the oneness of Allah. It's all about the risala, or the Prophet ﷺ, and that's true. Obviously, there is no inviting to Islam without those kinds of facts. But I think another important aspect, especially for those who are going to be in our inner orbit, is for them to know how much Islam is important to you. So I think with his kids, some are Muslim, some are not, but all of them are intimately aware of how important Islam was to their father's life. That goes a long way to making them sympathetic and pliable to executing his last affairs according to their dad's religion, because they know, even if I'm not a Muslim, even if I don't agree with Islam, or I haven't become a Muslim yet, they know this is something that was of the utmost importance to my father, and out of respect for him, I want to make sure that it's done in a way that will be pleasing to him.
That's right.
So you tell me. I can go in a little bit.
Let me ask you a question. So we have the importance of the wasiya. Who can draft it?
Uncle Sam drafts you into.
You get drafted.
You get conscripted, right? So
can anyone?
I mean, I would say yes and no. Probably not anyone can draft it.
Okay.
In that you do need to have knowledge of Islamic inheritance law. You need to have knowledge of Sharia. And there will be a few things that might differ between different schools of thought. That's why using at least a basic service like My Wasiya, and again, just to be clear, I'm not like this. Not like a paid affiliate link. I'm not associated with them in any way. It's it's a service I've used myself, and it's one that I recommend, especially to the laity. If you're not an expert in Islamic law, to draw it up on yourself and such, it's great. You go online, I think for about $150, you go online, you type in all your information, it spits it out. Like I said, you take it to a notary, and at least, boom, you've taken the first major step to do those. If you have more complicated affairs or whatnot, then you should probably go see. There are people that deal specifically in Islamic family law, specifically estate planning, that kind of thing. So I would say that no, it's not something that anybody can just sit down and scribble on a napkin and then that's good to go. But alhamdulillah, because in the modern age, again, people like Sheikh Joe and the others that worked with him there, or maybe it's My Wasiya and Sheikh Joe who consulted for him. I don't know how it worked, but I know that he was involved with it. That we have those kinds of services that are available. So if you don't have a massive budget to go and hire a lawyer or a Muslim lawyer to do that, then at least I can kind of get the ball rolling. I would recommend reading up on some of the verses in the Quran that at least discuss this. So, for instance, in Surah Al-Baqarah, like right before the verses about Ramadan and fasting, Allah says, "Kutiba alaykum idha hadara ahadakum al-maut," that it's mandatory, it's been prescribed for you that when any of you are approaching death, and we'll get a little bit into like, well, how do you know if you're dying, right? Because in the case of Brother Jamal, it was just boom, he just dropped and that was it, right? In taraka khayran al-wasiya lil walidain wal aqribain wal ma'ruf, right? You should make a will, you should make a wasiya, for parents and for your children and your other close relatives. حقا على المتقين. That is a right that is demanded of the people of piety. فمن بدله بعد ما سمعه فإنما إثمه على الذين يبدلونه. Then Allah Ta'ala says, and this is important, right? And therefore, anyone that would seek to change that wasiya, that bequeathment, after it's been made, then they would incur a sin, which means that what? This is human nature. People are going to, like you said, well, Grandpa told me I could do this. Dad said I could do that. Mom said this and that. It's human nature that people are going to want to try to get their fingers in the pie, and so to protect them from that, right? Inna Allah sami'un alim. فَمَنْ خَافَ min mus, for however, if you are fearful that maybe in the drafting of that document that there was a mistake, right, janafan aw ithman, or an intentional error, right, فَأَصْلَحَ بَيْنَهُمْ, and then you come in and you correct that, فَلَا إِثْمَ عَلَيْهِ, then there's no sin upon you for doing so. إِنَّ اللَّهَ غَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ, right? Allah is forgiving and merciful. So like from about verse 180 to 182, those are some good ones that give you a guideline. And specifically, Allah mentions, right, wasiyah, that particular wordage. And there are others like in Surah An-Nisa and some other places where Allah talks about this. But no, it's not something that I would say you could just, again, scribble on a napkin and you're good to go.
So, are there any key components that should be in there? Let's say if somebody just went online just to have something done right away.
Yes, I think especially living in America, or if you're in the UK or whatever, if you're not living in a Muslim country where Islam is going to be predominantly respected as the religion and maybe even the legal system, even if it is not Sharia 100%, even if it's like Sharia light or it inclines or it has aspects, they'll generally accept that, right? But in the case of in a completely Western secular country where that's not the case, then you want to be far more granular about stipulating not just who gets what, but also, hey, like, don't throw me in the air fryer, right? Don't throw me in the barbecue.
Instructions
right?
of the funeral.
Yeah, so you want to also have instructions in there specifically about how you want to be buried. And I would recommend going granular. Don't just say, I want to be buried Islamically. Because as we know, when they did away with Osama bin Laden, they gave him an Islamic burial at sea. Right, so people just be coming up with some stuff, right? So you don't want to have your Islamic burial at sea where they just throw you over with Davy Jones' locker and they say, oh, well, we gave him Islamic burial, right? So you wanna be very, very granular of saying, like, I want to be buried according to Islamic law, which includes these major things like I want to be washed, I want to be shrouded, I want to be buried in the most expedient form possible. Like what we've been dealing with, like, because he was under the care of a doctor, we're using that as legal leverage to say, look, we don't need an autopsy. We don't want one. We don't want to have this process, delayed so that we can get the body in the ground as fast as possible. So those are the other things that do need to be added to it. You definitely want to put those stipulations, in there as well. And that it's not just only about who gets 1/3 of this or 1/4 of that or 1/6 of this or so on and so on.
So maybe even including, I have a note here, appointment of the executor. Who's going?
Yeah, exactly. Like putting in the case of who would be the executor, or let's say you have let's say your wife is not Muslim and she's just not really familiar with Islam at all. Or like in the case of my wife, who's new to Islam, doesn't know all the ins and outs of all that stuff. Okay, you can contact these 5 people, right? I mean, obviously, inshallah, my wife is going to bury me according to Islam, but she doesn't necessarily know intimately what that might look like. Okay, but Brother Dawud does, and Omar does, and Imam Suhaib does, and Sheikh Joe does, and on and on. So here's these 5 people that you can call to consult to make sure that as you're going step by step, it's in accordance with Islam.
Yeah.
Right. So yes, that would definitely be something to put in there as well.
You also mentioned earlier about debt obligations. So the deceased.
Yeah. So I think it's important to, again, I want to go through this.
Sure.
Just again, this is not meant to be exhaustive, but it's enough to give an intro to hopefully pique your interest and to inform you that, wow, this is a bit more involved than what I maybe thought. And hopefully, not only for Muslims, but any non-Muslims that are out there that might see this that have Muslim family members to understand that it's a bit more involved than what you might think, right? So one of the ulama, he wrote, al-wasiyya wal-mirath, right? So bequest, right, which is giving a gift before, designating the gift before one dies, that will be actualized upon one's death. And then al-mirath, which is inheritance, which is what automatically kicks in upon one's death and goes to those people that the Quran stipulates, siblings, children, spouses, right? And that it deals with those that have either entitlements, right? Like the people of mirath, those people, they are entitled to them. Where the people of wasila, they're not entitled. That's why you have to give them a gift and stipulate it beforehand, right? And so here, right, yattafiqani fi umur. It's important to know that actually there is some overlap between the wasiya and the mirath, between the people that are given a gift and the people who are inheriting automatically. There is some overlap. ويفترقان في أمور أخرى. And then there are some things which they differ on. So he says, فمما يتفقان فيه, and as it relates to those things that they agree upon, he says, إن الملكية فيهما ملكية خلافية. So first off, ownership, right? Ownership for both of them is going to be mainly based upon what you would call success. It's going to go through succession, right? So ownership is both it's successive ownership that it only kicks in and becomes established, right? تثبت للإنسان بعد الموت. It only happens when a person dies, right? So you don't get to have mom's house or dad's bank account until they die, right? So it's, that's where both the wasiyah and the mirath, the bequesting and the inheriting agree. أن مؤنة التجهيز كالكفن والنحو that, like, so as it relates to the expenses for preparing, so al-kafan wal-dafn wal-ghusl, right? So when a Muslim dies, they're given a ghusl, and that's going to typically be done like at a mortuary. Again, if you're back home, so to speak, in some Muslim country, in the village somewhere, that might not be the case. But typically, in the modern context, in the West, washing of the body, shrouding of the body, and the burying of the body will incur expenses.
Right.
And they can be quite expensive. Like we were saying here, man, like the sandwich, even without the fries and the Coke, will run you like maybe 5 to 8 racks, like $5,000, $8,000, which for some people is a lot of money.
Sure.
And so before anybody, even the people that have a right to inheritance, before anybody that's given a gift, we have to pay for that first. So that's the first thing, is that we have to pay for the expense of actually prepping the deceased and burying them. He said, مُقَدَّمَةٌ عَلَيْهِمَا, that we have to deal with that first. We also have to deal with debts. Right? So like if there are outstanding debts before anybody gets to put their finger in the pie, you have to, the debts have to be taken care of. أن الورثة الموصى لهم لا يستحقون شيئا إلا بعد تسديد ما على الميت من ديون. So debts have to be taken care of.
Now, can I pause you right there? Why is that significant when it comes to the hereafter for the deceased, if those aren't taken care of?
Well, I mean, there are some ahadith that relate that a person can be sort of left in a sort of in-between state between this world and the next, right, depending on their affairs, if they're not handled in such, and that debt can kind of chain them to this life, right?
They're like in limbo.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't want to do that. So again, you might, wow, dad left us $1 million in the bank, and you're just, man, I'm broke and I can't wait to give me some of that money. Okay, but maybe your dad owed also some significant debts. You don't want to do that to your dad or whoever the person is, right? And get yours first, and then there's not enough money left over to cover the debts and the other things. No, those things have to. So there is a cascade. Yeah. There's an order of cascade of how the things have to happen, right? And even though this doesn't necessarily always apply, what أن القاتل, if the person was killed, the murderer, right, يحرم من الوصية. They are prohibited from obtaining a gift or a bequeathment from the deceased, على رأي كثير من العلماء, according to most of the ulama, كما يحرم من الميراث, just as they are forbidden to be able to inherit. And then the next one, أن كلا منهما حق متعلق بتركة الميت. So that each of them, each of them is a right related to the deceased's estate that reaches others without compensation. And this needs a little bit of definition, right? It needs a little bit of definition. يصل الغير بدون عود. So what does this mean? So imagine that in the case of a wasiyah, giving a gift. So imagine that like The grandfather has a special watch. He has like a nice Rolex, and he wants to give that Rolex to his granddaughter after he's dead. That's what he stipulates in his wasiyah, in his will. The granddaughter gets to have that watch without having to give anything back in return. All right, without having to give anything back in return. Right, it's a gift that he decided to give after he passed, and there's nothing else that's due in exchange. When it comes to mirath, or to inheritance, so like, let's say like a father dies and his children automatically inherit his house and money according to Islamic law. It means how many shares they would get of his wealth and whatnot. The children, likewise, don't need to pay anything for the house to get it. Right? They would just simply, they would get it because they have an istihqaq, they have an entitlement to it. One thing that could problematize that, going back to debts, is imagine, okay, they get the house, but what if there's still a mortgage on the house, or there's back taxes on the house? That's debt. That's from the duyun. That would have to be paid off first before they could get that. They can't take it and then, oh, well, we'll work it out later. No, that has to be taken care of, right, first. And then lastly, the at least in this section, right, he says, أن كل منهما مشروط بوفاة المالك لا يستحق إلا بموت صاحب التركة. So he said that each of them, it is conditional upon the death of the owner of the estate, and is not entitled except by death to the owner, meaning that you don't get it until the person dies, right? And that could, meaning that if they decide, maybe they said to you one day, oh, you'll get my house, right? But then they decide to give something later on before they died. They put in their wasiyah, oh, I'm going to give this or that to so-and-so, and then you show up after the death and like, well, this is mine. Like, no, actually, he stipulated that. That's binding, right? You can't just, right? So you can't get it, or you can say, well, I'm going to take it before. I know Dad is sick and he's on his deathbed. I'm going to go ahead and take that now. No, you can't. You can't take it preemptively. And then now I think just briefly, now where is it that they differ? It says, وَمِنَ الْفُرُوقِ بَيْنَ الْوَصِيَّةِ وَالْمِيرَاثِ. I think it's important to know then how do they differ. And I'll maybe just summarize some of the English here because I know the Arabic is sort of long. So inheritance, right, is established for the heirs, first off, by what Allah decrees. So there are certain verses, we'll link to them again in the show notes on the Substack, where Allah says, like, the sister gets this fraction, and the brother gets that fraction, and the husband gets this, and the wife gets that, right? So this is what something that is qata'. These are determinations made by Allah Ta'ala, and they cannot be changed, right? So those have to be respected. They cannot be changed, and they're defined in the Quran. Whereas the wasiyah, right, the bequest, it's established for those that are legally capable of having that, but it's a voluntary action. So if I'm Muslim and my dad is Muslim and he dies, whether my brother likes it or not, or my sister likes it or not, or what, I'm due some of that. Whether, even if I don't want it, I'm due it, right? I'm due that. I can't change that. And just like you were saying, I can't say, well, I was actually Dad's favorite, or I changed his bedpan for the last 2 years of his life, so actually I should get an extra share of this. No, sorry, those are immutable. Right. We cannot change those. Ownership and inheritance is mandatory. It does not depend on the decree of the bequeather, right? Again, when you're giving somebody the wasiyah or the gift, you can determine who gets what and so on. But when it comes to inheritance, no. Again, it's
already written.
It's already written, right? Now, this is the third part. I do want to go in a little bit of detail. الوصية مقدمة في الإخراج على الميراث. So, as it relates to the bequeathment, a bequest takes precedence over inheritance in terms of distribution. This is important, right? The heirs of inheritance, right? What the Quran talks about, like the wife gets this third and this quarter and this sixth and fifth, right? Those are the heirs. But the person that's given the gift, the wasiyah, that takes precedence over the inheritance. And so the heirs don't receive anything until the bequest or the wasiyah is fulfilled first. So in the case where, let's say, you're Muslim, your wife is not, if you die and rely only upon inheritance, she gets nothing. Or if you're thinking, well, my kids will get it, but they'll be nice and they'll give it to her. You cannot rely upon that. If you want your wife to be ensured that after the cost of the funeral and after any debts, that your wife gets something before the kids even get the heirs get theirs, you have to make a wasiyah. You have to put that in to stipulate that in
and that takes precedence.
And that takes precedence.
Interesting.
Over the inheritance, right? That's why there's two here that I really want to. Now also, right, al-irth la yakuna ma ikhtilaf ad-din. That as it relates to inheritance, it cannot occur where there is a difference in religion. So again, I'm a Muslim, my wife is a Christian, she cannot inherit from me, and vice versa. Let's say my wife is Christian, and her dad dies and leaves her a house. I don't have any claim to that, right? Or she dies, and I think, oh, well, that was my wife's house that she got from her dad. Well, that's my house now. No. By inheritance, no, right? Al-irth la yakuna ma'a al-ikhtilaf ad-din. Now, she could put in her own, she could stipulate that in a bequeathment that I do, but by Islamic law, I have no istihqaq either. I have no entitlement. So that's the other important thing that I wanted to mention specifically when it comes to the differences between wasiyah and mirath, between bequeathment or bequest and inheritance, is that those are those limitations. Now, when it comes to the heirs, again, inheritance, they're specified by Sharia, right? So the Quran says so and so gets a third, a quarter, a fifth, a sixth, right? And the shares are determined where those who are going to be the beneficiaries of the wasiyah, they're not specified. So you don't have you have to determine what it's going to be, right? You can't just say, oh, my wife gets something. No, well, what is that? You have to be specific. Right. Inheritance is linked to certain causes specified by Sharia, which the deceased cannot control. So let's say you have, let's say you were in your first marriage and your wife was Muslim and you had 3 kids. And then in your second marriage, you had 2 more kids, but you're estranged from them. These things happen. You can't say, well, because I was estranged with my kids and, they weren't good to me as their dad, or, well, they're not, I'm cutting them out. And I've seen this happen more times than you would probably really want to know. You don't get to determine, because of your emotional relationship with all of your children who are Muslim, you do not get to determine who gets a share simply because the emotional relationship, was better with this group and not with that group. No. It is also affected by known impediments that the deceased cannot override. So again, I may want to give you as my son or my daughter, or that you get your entitled share according to the Quran. But if I die with a bunch of debt, right, and I die, I don't have any money to even bury myself, or what little money I had has to get chewed up in that, there's nothing I can do about that. Right. So these are things that we need to be aware of. The last one I'll mention here is inheritance is a cause for, what is it? It's a cause for transferring inherited ownership of certain things like houses, money, right? With all of those transferable rights, which includes, and this is something that's important, called haqq shuf'a, what we call, I think in English, preemption. Now, what is preemption? Preemption is it's like the right to, how can I put this in the simplest ways, right? So, for instance, imagine that it's the right in Islam that allows co-owners of a property to purchase the share. So let's say like you and you and your wife own a property together, or you and your sister own a property together, and somebody dies, before it would just simply go to the shares, you could have the right of preemption, which means that I'll buy out the share first before it is given to outsiders, right? Before it's given to outsiders, right? So this is, so for instance, like if Ahmed and Khalid jointly own a piece of farmland, Ahmed decides to sell his share to an outsider. Like there is a right of preemption, right? So based upon this principle, it's the ideas of protecting harm or inconvenience, but also allows you to maintain generational wealth sometimes, right? Not losing property. So, these are perhaps a bit more granular and technical than what's needed, but I wanted to at least cover some of these to let people know that it's a bit more complicated than what you might have thought, and that will is not the same as inheritance and vice versa. Right. And how do, and again, just because you're prohibited or your non-Muslim family is prohibited from having a automatic right to inherit from you, by no means that you can't, like, you love your family. Like let's say you have a non-Muslim sibling. In Islam, if they were Muslim, they would have entitlement to a certain share, but they're not. But I still, I love my brother. I love my sister. I want them to have something. Okay, so I make a wasiyah. I can bequeath something to them.
Right. So, and this is the intricacies, and I would say, part of the miracle of the Quran, in that Allah is dealing with people, because it's so detailed.
It's
when it comes to,
detailed.
Like I know some of them. Oh man, this is like the chapter of the inheritance laws are like family law. It's heavy and dense and hard to recite sometimes, but there's a purpose for that, because Allah knows what He has created, and Allah deals with people not how they should be, but how they are.
Yes.
And human nature kicks in. So He said, let me outline it very clearly for these people.
Yes.
So they understand how to get along here.
Yes.
The flip side of that, or the other side of the coin of this, is, while we got the mechanics and we got the know-how, the coping of the loss. And that's where all of this gets kind of muddled. And some of the families, I don't care, just take whatever. I don't even want to deal with none of this stuff.
Yes.
And others like, no, I need it all. It should be mine. And, so everything is just out of whack, disorientated. And so how are we dealing with, how we cope? What are the coping mechanisms in Islam for the deceased? And so my default is how the Prophet ﷺ taught us, and he has been through every experience to teach us, because he is the best of examples. Yes. And he lost the majority of his loved ones, Muslim, non-Muslims, and in particular his son, Ibrahim. And he was crying, and his beard was wet, and the companions were confused. Ya Rasulullah, I thought you said we shouldn't cry excessively. He said, I didn't say you shouldn't cry excessively. He said like this, a little less, but don't go into extremes in your action and your sounds.
Yes.
But to cry, he said, we miss him. He's left, and we miss him, so we have emotion.
Yeah.
But we're happy. He's with Allah.
Yes.
So he's moved on to the next stage. Of course, that was his son, a young child at the time, a boy. But so we saw how the Prophet ﷺ dealt with loss. He grieved. And
you can have can have your human emotions about things, right? It doesn't you're not denied that, but kind of like we went over this weekend in those verses from Surah Al-Ma'idah, don't ask excessively on things that if they were made known to you, they might actually cause you a lot of discomfort. Yeah. They might seriously trouble you. So naturally, I think when somebody dies, the first thing the thoughts go to is, well, where are they? Are they with Allah? Are they still in the grave? Are they going to go to Jannah, or are they going to go to Jahannam? Are they this or that?
Or the flip side, I know they're with Allah.
I know they're with God. I know that,
Yes.
like, don't start pontificating and speculative thinking about things, because either, as Allah says, "Ba'd al-adhanna itham," some of speculative thinking is sinful, or, if you ask about some things, it may cause you a lot of distress. Like the man, there's the two hadith that I related. The man said to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "Man abi, who's my father?" He said, "Abuka Fulan, your father and so and so," because his name was like I forget his name, but Ibn Fulan. He said, "Well, your father was Fulan and you're Ibn Fulan." So then another man came and said, "Aina abi, where is my father?" Well, okay, well, you're going to get that answer too. Finnar, your father's in the fire. And the thing is, you have now asked the Prophet, he's not gonna make something up.
It's not maybe. It's not.
So if he gives you an answer, it is what it is. He's not making it up. It's not off the fly. He doesn't speak of his own caprice. Now, that might be really disturbing versus, okay, like you said, your dad is gone. He's gone back to Allah. Allah is the best of judges. Allah is merciful. Okay, fine. Let it go. And most importantly, be concerned with you. Like when somebody, like we were talking today, I said, I'll be honest. I'm not going to go to the extent that, Jamal is in Jannah, Firdaus al-A'la. I make dua that is where he is at.
Right.
Sincerely. Because in my relationship with him, he was one of the most kind and gentle and sincere and helpful brothers that I've met. And so I sincerely hope that he is from those that Allah Ta'ala talks about, الَّذِينَ يَدْخُلُونَ الْجَنَّةَ بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ, that he will be amongst those that will enter into paradise without any reckoning. And so I earnestly hope, I said, but I'll be honest, while I don't know where he's at, I have a good feeling about that. I'm way more concerned about myself. I said, I'm not fearful for Jamal. I'm fearful for me.
Sure.
Because I definitely don't got no feeling like, oh yeah, Marcus with no, not where Marcus is at, right?
Right.
So I'm a lot more trepidation about where am I going to wind up, right?
And that's a good, our perspective. Once we've lost a loved one, we shouldn't be overwhelmed to a degree where we've lost orientation of what we need to still continue to do here. And
right.
So part of the grieving process is that you're making a lot of dhikr in remembrance of Allah, because shaitan is bothering you.
Yes.
You might have saw the image of the individual of the deceased. You can't get that image out. The last moment,
yes.
This, that, whatever it might be. So you keep being bombarded and overwhelmed with imagery and experience and loss. And, so it's just a flood of emotion.
Yeah.
And so the best thing is to reorientate yourself, dhikr of Allah, reading Quran, get yourself back orientated. And right when those thoughts come back, because we're building memory, like we've shared before, we're not saying remove the memory of the history that you had with this person.
Of course not.
Never, right? But reflect on the good things.
Stay in your lane.
And stay in your lane and start to build new memory.
And focus upon your own, you should be far more concerned about your own demise.
Yes.
There was a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah,
so,
let's take them.
We know that the non-Muslim doesn't inherit from the Muslim, but can the non-Muslim be gifted by the Muslim upon death? Well, that is what the wasiyah is, right? So the wasiyah, though, right, the bequeathment or the bequest, it is something that is drafted up and constructed
to make sure
while the Muslim is alive,
yes,
if it happens to involve a non-Muslim. So it's something that you determine and write while you're still alive, but it only kicks in upon your death.
And you want to do that because you don't want them not to get it.
If I got all my, whatever, the original, I don't know.
Human beatbox. No.
Exactly. If I got all my, original Steve Ditko Spider-Mans or, Jack Kirby Silver Surfers, and I want, my neighbor who's not Muslim to have them, I can do that now while I'm alive, put that in my wasiyah, but he will only get them when I'm gone. Right. So that is what the wasiyah is. Yeah. Right.
I knew this was going to spark questions.
Yeah, exactly. I know. Is the precedent of this associated to being a final act of sadaqah on behalf of the benefactor? I mean, generally speaking, yes. I mean, if you're giving somebody a gift, it is an act of charity, so to speak, right? Now, there are other, as we know, the Quran defines sadaqah sometimes as more specifically things that, like, again, if I give somebody my original Silver Surfer comic book collection, I mean, the comics themselves are not necessarily what you consider like some great actor, but it's an act of kindness, and might be like, oh, it's an act of kindness. Maybe Allah will guide him because the act of giving a gift will soften the heart. And we actually know, I'm not saying you would do this with your comic book collection, but in the verses in the Quran that deal with zakah, right? Because sometimes in the Quran, zakah and sadaqah are used interchangeably. And just for a quick note, zakah is the purification of wealth that is given as a so-called charity, but it is only given generally to Muslims, where sadaqah can be given to either or. Yeah. The one caveat is that zakah, which is taxed, so to speak, from the Muslims and then distributed to the Muslims, right? There is one form of zakah of which the Muslims are taxed, in which it can be given to a non-Muslim or a group of non-Muslims, right? If it's for those who are maybe considering Islam and as a act of kindness to soften the heart to embrace Islam. And so the Quran does talk about that. But generally speaking, yes, I mean, it is an act of sadaqah.
And so there might be, it could fall into the category leaving this gift to some as sadaqah jariyah. So it's something that might continue depending on the.
It depends. I mean, you could leave them. Maybe you had an orchard. Yeah. And you could leave that person.
That food kept growing.
The food kept growing, and people. So potentially, yes.
Oh well, what about the waqf? Now,
right.
Is that an institutional base from an institution, or is that from an individual that had a great amount of money?
Individuals can establish a waqf, right? Which is what we'll call, what's the English word?
Like endowment.
An endowment, yes, right. So you could establish. Let's say you want to establish in the religious sense, you want to establish like a Quran school. Okay, so that's a waqf, right? But you could also say, I want to establish like a veterinarian hospital that would benefit Muslim and non-Muslim alike, just something for the animals, right? And which Muslim or non-Muslim could bring their animals there. Yes. Now, how you would do that, or maybe you could, you could leave that where a person would be in charge of it, and maybe the person in charge of it would be a non-Muslim, but then it's not, or putting a stipulation, hey, this veterinary hospital is yours so long as it remains, free and open to the public or whatever it is. I mean, I suppose so. Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably get creative with that kind of thing. Yeah. So, but yeah, hopefully, if nothing else out of this, I know it was maybe a little bit technical, is just to be more mindful and not let more time slip by. I mean, I just saw Jamal on Friday, right? I saw him as I was coming in to set up for Jumu'ah, and we spoke a little bit after Jumu'ah, and Saturday morning, afternoon, he was gone. So don't always think you will have the time to do it. In fact, when we were talking with Khalil, he and Khalil were just saying that they had just had a conversation not that long ago about wanting to do this very thing so that his wife could get, X, Y, and Z, because his wife is a Muslim, and some of his non-Muslim kids would get this and that, right? Wanting to do that. And what did Khalil say? Oh, we were just busy and we never got around to doing it. Yeah. And now he's gone. And unfortunately, if we're able to do things according to Islam, then it will be a matter of relying upon the kindness of strangers if those things that he wanted to go to the non-Muslim, family members, if they get it, but they have no right to demand that. Yeah. So if you have that, again, I think that'll be more common perhaps with converts than not, make sure that you take the time to do that. And we'll again, not that the links that I put will be exhaustive by any means, but I'll put a few things in the show notes, inshallah, to direct everybody. So I think that's it, man. Does that
Oh man,
does that wrap it up?
that's a wrap.
Is it time to cue up?
Cue it up.
Here we go.
Here we go.
Yeah, man.
Outro.
Does your imam not even know how to make a beat?
Oh man, I know he
Man. Yeah. All right. Well, episode 23, Middle Ground Podcast. We were live, man. I got to get my man.
We'll do it live.
Yeah.
Do it live.
It's just not. It's not live if it doesn't have Bill O'Reilly. Inshallah, we'll see you in the next episode.
Sit down.
Assalamu alaikum.